All right, I'm live. Thank you, Ozzy. And thank you, Mr. Uko, as well. Both of you have been instrumental in organizing this event. And thank you, Ashbury community, for receiving me today. This is wonderful. I'll begin with a couple years ago, I was exploring my race and identity. And I said to my Black father, Dad, I feel like you raised me to be white. And he said, yes, I did. And I was like, okay, we need to unpack that. Before I go on, though, I'll let you know what to expect today. So I'm going to introduce you to a bit of my story, my family's Canadian story, which is a story that many of us have in common. And then we'll get into the idea of worldviews and African Indigenous worldviews and why they are so important right now. And that will lead us then into something that's happening at Ashbury College right now that's really important. So I was born in Winnipeg, Manitoba, on Treaty 1 territory. These are the unceded ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, the Innu, Oji-Cree, Dene, and Dakota First Nation. I was born to a white mother of British ancestry and a Black father of West African ancestry. Now, my father was actually born in Barbados, so it was a few generations before him that his West African ancestors were brought on slave ships by the British to Barbados and enslaved on the sugar plantations. Stripped of their indigenous African knowledge systems and assimilated into the colonial British culture. Now, by the time my father was born in Barbados in 1937, slavery had long been abolished, but the domination of the colonial British had not, and so he too was brought up in the false belief system of superiority of the British culture, which comes with it a false belief in superiority of whiteness. So that when my father immigrated to Canada in the 60s, a land also colonized by European settlers, he knew he was coming to a land where the whiter you are, the better, where assimilation to whiteness is what you need to do to make it. So I understood when my father said, yes, I raised you to be white. And I don't blame him. I admire my father deeply and what he overcame as a Black man entering into the Canadian context of the early 60s, into the colonial context. He lost his accent as quickly as he could. He parted his Negro hair. He left his backwards thinking, as he calls it, behind and conformed his mind to the boxes of colonial thinking. And he made something of himself. My father became an accomplished civil engineer, proudly serving the last 10 years of his career as a project manager for the refurbishment of the Parliament buildings. I admire my father very deeply, and he raised me to be white, to believe in the superiority of the colonial British culture. And I'm here today to say it doesn't need to be like that anymore. People of African descent do not need to sacrifice who they are in order to make it in the world today. And in fact, the world really needs us to remember who we are, because we carry knowledge that the world needs right now. Our ancestral Indigenous knowledge is needed in the world right now. Our ancestral worldviews in particular are needed in the world right now. We'll get to that, the importance of it in a moment, but first I want to address what is a worldview. What are worldviews? And this idea that we can have an African worldview or a European worldview. Different cultures have different worldviews, and it's the foundational ways that you see the world, that you make sense of the world, the basic beliefs and assumptions that you have about what the world is made of. And so different cultures have different worldviews, and both can coexist and be valid. And to illustrate that, I have an image I'd like to share with you. I hope you can all see this right now. So when you look at this image, I'm curious how many of you first see a duck? And how many of you first saw rabbit? And how many of you now are going duck, rabbit, duck, rabbit, duck, rabbit? Different ways of seeing, of approaching this image will result in different solutions of what you see, either a duck or a rabbit. Now, is one better than the other? Is one superior to the other? Is one superior and one inferior? Not really. It's not really about what's superior or what is inferior in this image, but a recognition of difference. The different ways of seeing, you can see different things and arrive at different solutions, while African Indigenous worldviews are different from British colonial worldviews, and their difference matters. And I have another image to illustrate one of the key differences of Indigenous African worldviews. So I'll pull this up as well. This is M.C. Escher's Mosaic 2. Now, the aesthetic of this image is powerful to begin with. We have black and white organisms all interconnected into a whole, which is powerful to begin with. But what I want to do is bring your attention up to the left-hand corner up here. You'll see there's a bird. There's two different ways of seeing this bird that can represent two different worldviews. So if I were to ask you to identify the bird and to define the bird and perhaps even draw the bird out on a separate piece of paper, one way of seeing this would say, well, this is the bird. Here's its belly, here's its beak and its head and its wings and its tail. And then you would draw out a bird with this outline. Another way of seeing this from another worldview would be to define the bird as the bird is the underside of a fish and the back of a camel and the tail of a lobster and the profile of a monkey. In other words, the bird is defined by its relationships. And so if you were to draw out that bird, you would see something a bit different. So in that first worldview, if you were to draw out the bird in that first worldview, it might look something like this. It's just a bird. There it is on its own. The second worldview, you would draw something and it might look a bit more like this. You would have to draw the fish and the camel and the lobster and the monkey, because it's the coming together of the relationships of all of those organisms that makes the bird. So much so that if you took away the camel and the fish and the lobster And the monkey, if you took those organisms away and their lines with them, the bird would cease to exist. Bird is made by its relationship. So these are two different worldviews, two different ways of seeing bird. The first one can characterize what we call a Eurocentric worldview. So seeing the world from a European perspective. It's also known as an object-oriented worldview, seeing things and objects and being able to extract objects from their environment. So we can take birds out of its ecosystem, put it into a lab, break the bird down into parts to get to know it. It's object-oriented. This one is a relationship-oriented worldview. This is more characteristic of an Indigenous African worldview, where we see the world in terms of relationships where everything is interconnected. And if I want to come to know that bird, I need to study it in its ecosystem of relationships in order to come to know it. And as a scientist, I must enter into participation intimately with that bird, not have an objective stance where my subject is separate from me and I'm objective. No, I come into deep participatory relationship with that bird to come to know it. It's a different way of coming to know based on a different worldview. Are we objects that can be discrete and individualized, or are we deeply, intimately interconnected? And those worldviews show up in our cultures as well. So in an object-oriented worldview and in that kind of dominant culture, people, well, it's very materialistic. It's about objects, material, but also people can be individualized. And so we become individuals competing against one another. Survival of the fittest type of mentality where an individual can rise to the top and receive awards and be recognized as an individual who rises above the rest. In an Indigenous African worldview that's more relational, it's built on cooperation and collaboration. You are your community. You are defined by your community. And there's no individual that can really rise above the rest, because when someone rises, they bring their community with them. When a person rises, they do so in such a way that they create a motion that moves through us all, so we all rise, because we're all connected, like the bird to the fish, to the camel, to the lobster, to the monkey. We're all connected, so we all rise. It's a different worldview, different way of seeing ourselves in relation to one another. And now, this relational worldview is indigenous to all cultures, if you go far enough back. Some would say we're all African when you go far enough back. But even when you look at indigenous European cultures, Celtic cultures, obviously the indigenous cultures of this land that we're on, we find relational worldviews. And I will acknowledge that that artist, M.C. Escher, is a European artist. He had a deep relational worldview. But it's just that some cultures have come to value one way of seeing over another. And in the colonial British worldview, the Eurocentric worldview has come to value the object-oriented worldview. Indigenous African worldviews have come to value that relationship-oriented worldview. So these different worldviews, they are important because they come up, when you start seeing the world differently, you come up with different questions about the world, and different questions lead us to different types of solutions. And so Mr. Uko has shared with me a wonderful story that illustrates this. He is speaking about the Maasai people of Kenya. And he said, you know, in this culture, when we greet one another, we don't say, how are you? We say, how are the children? You meet someone, you ask, how are the children? And when you ask that, you're not asking how that person's children are. You're asking, how are the children of the community? Because it is the collective health of the youth of the community that is the indicator of the health of any one person. It's not how are you. Your health is not located inside of you as an individual. Your health is dependent on the health of your youth. How are your children doing? It's a different type of question. And so that different question comes from a different worldview. And that's important. And it's important because we need different solutions right now. The world is asking for different types of solutions to what we're going through right now. We are in a global pandemic, global health crisis. We are facing global environmental crises. We are in a period of global social crises of mass inequality. We are experiencing global political crises of fascism and oppression. And all of these crises are deeply interconnected. They're deeply interconnected. We need a worldview that can see that deep interconnectedness, the relationships among all these crises, so that we can even come up with new types of questions, so we can come up with new types of solutions to these problems that we're facing. And that is the African worldview, is deeply relational and sees those interconnections and has ways of coming up with different questions. How are the children, not how are you? So we need to reclaim these knowledge systems, right? It's time to stop assimilating to the Eurocentric worldviews and ways and culture. We need to, like I think it's the Sankofa bird that's reaching back to the egg behind its back. We need to reach back and pull those indigenous knowledge systems forward again so we can move forward with new solutions. Which brings me to something that's happening at Ashbury right now. So, as I understand, Ashbury is an internationally recognized institution, one of Canada's leading co-educational schools. I hear you have 60 countries at Ashbury College and 33 countries represented in your boarding program. And what I also hear going on these days is a coming together of the Ashbury community and youth in a working group on plurality, asking how do we recognize our diversity and plurality? And that's really important, because what I hear the youth are saying is, yes, Ashbury is an internationally recognized institution, but how do we recognize our internationality? That's a different question. Not how do we become recognized internationally, but how do we recognize our internationality? That's a radically different question. Reminds me like a bit like an Afrocentric type of question, a deeply relational question. How do we recognize the diversity and plurality of our worldviews and bring them together in deep relation with one another for the sake of rising together and co-creating new futures, learning from our past, bringing our ancestral knowledge from our past to move forward in new solutions? And the kinds of solutions that come from those kinds of questions, the kinds of solutions bring a different kind of richness with them. It's a different kind of richness that will come from those kinds of solutions and those kinds of questions, a type of richness in the community, a kind of richness that has no dollar sign beside it, a kind of richness that is fundamentally different, the one in which a Black man from West Africa no longer feels the need to raise his daughter to be white in Canada. So thank you for that. Thank you. Thank you for receiving me today, and I encourage you to continue reaching back into your ancestral knowledge systems, bring them forward. The world needs our African worldviews right now. We need this knowledge. And Ashbury, you're doing it, and thank you.